Okay, this is 101, week 12, part 7. I am at the bottom of page 2, looking at paragraph 8 in Eric Fromm's essay about disobedience. So he says, he makes this distinction that's important between a rebel and a revolutionary. See, a revolutionary disobeys lots of people, the government probably, because he's obeying his conscience, or he's obeying like a higher thing. But he says a rebel is just somebody who always disobeys no matter what. And that's not going to work. That's not a good idea. Okay, cool. So now I'm on the last paragraph on page 2. He says, in order to prevent a confusion of terms, an important qualification must be made. Okay, this is a tough paragraph. Paragraph 8, bottom of page 2. It's a tough paragraph. We're going to need to spend a little bit of time working on this one. It's difficult, but it's real important. He says, in order to prevent a confusion of terms, an important qualification must be made. I want to be specific about this, a detail. He says, obedience to a person, institution, or power, heteronomous obedience, is submission. It implies the abdication of my autonomy and the acceptance of a foreign will or judgment in place of my own. Oh boy, this is difficult. Okay, so heteronomous means like other than me. Hetero means other. Heterosexual is someone who likes a gender other than your own. So heteronomous means other. So he says heteronomous obedience is obeying someone outside of you, like your boss or a king or whatever. So he says obedience to a person, institution, or power, heteronomous obedience, is submission. It implies the abdication, meaning giving up, of my autonomy, my decision-making ability, and the acceptance of a foreign will, foreign just meaning somebody else, somebody who's not you, and the acceptance of a foreign will or judgment in place of my own. Okay, so he's saying, listen, he says that heteronomous obedience, meaning it's just like when you're obeying someone outside. Somebody's yelling at you and you do what they say. That's it. That's heteronomous. And it means like, I'm not going to do what I want. I'm going to do what this guy yelling at me wants. I'm giving up my desires and I'm just going to do what the person yelling at me wants me to do. Obedience to a person, institution, or power, heteronomous obedience, is submission. It implies the abdication, meaning giving up my autonomy, my ability to make decisions, and the acceptance of a foreign will or judgment in place of my own. So he says, listen, sometimes when you talk about obeying, you're talking about obeying somebody outside of you, heteronomous, that's like yelling at you. But there's a different kind of obeying. He says, obedience to my own reason or conviction. He calls this autonomous obedience, meaning sometimes you're obeying the guy that's yelling at you out there, but sometimes you're obeying what's in your own heart. That's different. He says there's a big difference between obeying, saying, I'm not going to do what I want to do. I'm going to do what this guy yelling at me wants to do. I'm going to do what my boss, I want to go home, but my boss says keep working, so I'm just going to do what he says because he's yelling at me. But that's one kind of obedience, and he says that's bad. But there's a good kind of obedience when you say, there is a voice in my heart telling me right from wrong, and I'm going to obey it no matter what. That's a good kind of obedience. You're obeying something in here, something you've figured out. So he says, obedience to my own reason or conviction. He calls this autonomous obedience. Is not an act of submission, but one of affirmation. It's a good thing. My conviction and my judgment, if authentically mine, are part of me. I follow them rather than the judgment of others. I am being myself. Hence, the word obey can only be applied in a metaphorical sense, in which a meaning which is fundamentally different from the case of heteronomous obedience. Don't get hung up on this heteronomous, autonomous. It's not worth it. The point is that the point of paragraph 8 is that there's two different kinds of obeying. You can obey a boss that's yelling at you, meaning you don't do what you think is right, you just do what the guy yelling at you thinks is right. But there's another kind of obedience where you obey what's in your heart. You have a little voice in you that tells you right from wrong. And if you obey that, that's a different kind. So people say, is obedience good or is obedience bad? Well, it depends what you're obeying. If you're just obeying the guy yelling at you and you think what he says is wrong, but you're doing it anyway, that's probably bad. But if you're obeying what's in your heart, if you're obeying what you truly believe and sticking to it no matter what, that's good kind of obedience. And this is the tricky part about being human, is figuring that out. What are you going to obey? You're going to obey the guy yelling at you, or you're going to obey the guy giving you your paycheck, or are you going to obey the little voice in here that tells you right from wrong? Okay, cool. Well, this is going pretty well. As usual, the longer you do these things, the easier they get. This is part of college. You just read it. Yep. You just read a lot of books, and the more you read, the easier they get. And even when you start a book and you're like, I don't know what's going on in this book, pretty quickly you figure it out, and it turns out that you can handle it. Okay, paragraph 9 is not really a paragraph. It's really just a single sentence. But here's paragraph 9. I'm at the top of page 3. But this distinction still needs two further qualifications, one with regard to the concept of conscience and the other with regard to the concept of authority. So paragraph 9 is not really a paragraph. Don't worry about it. His point is he's going to make it more complicated, because that's what philosophers do. Philosophers always make things more complicated. Students sometimes hate that. In fact, I think a lot of times they hate it because they want things to be simple. They're just like, look, what's on the test? Tell me what to do. I want to obey. And philosophers are like, well, it's sort of complicated. And you're like, well, wait a minute. Is obedience good or bad? And your priest and your king and your boss tell you, you better obey. Obedience is good. And they're like, Eric Fromm, does he think the opposite? Maybe he thinks disobedience is bad. Maybe he thinks disobedience is good and obedience is bad. And it's like, oh, well, it's more complicated than that. Depends what you're obeying. It's tricky. Now, he made that distinction earlier, which is an important one, between are you obeying the guy outside of you that's yelling at you, or are you obeying this voice in your heart? The kind of, because I think he has an idea that in here you fundamentally know right from wrong. I'm not really sure that's true. I worry about that sometimes. I'm not sure it's as simple as that. He makes it sound like if you just listen to the voice in here, it's the right thing to do. And I'm not. I think a lot of people have a voice in here. People go, well, people know right from wrong in here. I'm like, do they though? But Fromm thinks that there's a little voice in here telling you right from wrong. Fromm thinks there's a voice in here telling you right from wrong, and a lot of people ignore it, and that's where trouble comes from. I do think that's true, but I don't think it's necessarily obvious that the voice in here knows right from wrong all the time. But that's my issue and not his. All right. So he's about to get way more complicated, and I am sorry for how complicated this is about to get. He's talking about the conscience, your conscience. That's that little voice inside of you that tells you right from wrong. And he's about to make it really complicated. I'm on paragraph 10, top of page 3. The word conscience is used to express two phenomena which are quite distinct from each other. He says that when you talk about obeying your conscience, there's two different things. One is the authoritarian conscience, which is the internalized voice of an authority whom we are eager to please and afraid of displeasing. This authoritarian conscience is what most people experience when they obey their conscience. It's the conscience which Freud speaks of, which he called superego. This is Sigmund Freud was the inventor of sort of psychoanalysis and psychology and stuff. And so he talked about this voice in your head telling you what to do all the time. He called it the superego. Not really important that you know that. The superego represents the internalized commands and prohibitions of the father accepted by the son out of fear. Different from the authoritarian conscience is the humanistic conscience. So there's an authoritarian conscience and a humanistic conscience. Different from the authoritarian conscience is the humanistic conscience. This is the voice present in every human being and independent from external sanctions and rewards. Humanistic conscience is based on the fact that as a human being, we have an intuitive knowledge of what is human and inhuman, what is conducive of life and destructive of life. This conscience serves our functioning as human beings. It is the voice which calls us back to ourselves, to our humanity. It's what I just said, that there's a little voice inside of you that knows right and wrong, and you should listen to it. So this is where Fromm gets tricky. So that paragraph 10 is about the difference between the authoritarian conscience and the humanistic conscience. Again, what's the conscience? Conscience is that little voice. Sometimes I point here, sometimes I point here. I don't really know where it is. There's a little voice inside of you that tells you right from wrong. But he says the problem is, and so at first he was like, listen, maybe disobedience is good, maybe obedience is bad. And then he's like, well, it depends. And every time you obey, you're actually disobeying. And every time you disobey, you're obeying. So it's more complicated than that. Now he introduces another complication. He says, well, sometimes are you going to obey the guy yelling at you? Or are you going to obey the voice in your heart? But now he says something tricky. There are two voices inside of you. And the question is, where did they come from? Because sometimes the voice inside you, if it's the humanistic conscience, that's that little voice that knows right from wrong. The problem is that a lot of people, when they get yelled at enough, have the voice of the person who yells in their head. So if you walk around, you may hear the voice of your mother telling you right from wrong. Is she right? Like, should you listen to that voice? Even though it's coming from inside you, is it really still you? Or is it like, he uses the phrase internalized. It's the idea that something else, like if somebody yells at you enough, their voice gets in your head. And then it's like, you have two voices in your head. It's like, there's the voice that knows right from wrong. And then there's the voice of your mom or your boss that's just like in your brain all the time. How do you figure out which one's which? Because both voices are coming from inside you. But it's hard to know which one's really you and which one is authority having brainwashed you. I'll pick this up in the next video. It's complicated.